You won't believe what happened after Karen, the HOA president, decided to cut down my tree without permission, and what happened next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. I'd always loved my home. It wasn't a mansion, but it was cozy, peaceful, and had one of the most beautiful oak trees in the neighborhood. This tree had been standing long before I moved in, its wide branches stretching over my backyard and part of my driveway, providing shade and a sense of calm. Birds nested in it, squirrels played in its branches, and in the fall, its golden leaves turned my property into something out of a painting. It was more than just a tree to me. It was a part of my home, a part of my life. Unfortunately, not everyone shared my appreciation for it. Enter Karen. When Karen became the president of our HOA, things changed almost overnight. She was the type of person who thrived on control, the kind who saw herself as the queen of the neighborhood. If there was a rule to enforce, she did it with an iron fist. If there wasn't a rule, she'd make one up on the spot. At first, her reign was just annoying. Letters in the mail about minor infractions, complaints about how my trash bins weren't lined up properly on the curb, ridiculous demands that I repaint my mailbox because it wasn't the same shade as the others on the street. But then, her attention turned to my tree. It started with passive-aggressive comments whenever she saw me outside. "You know, that tree is an eyesore," she'd say, shaking her head like she was deeply disappointed in my life choices. "It doesn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I ignored her at first, thinking she'd eventually get bored and move on to harassing someone else. But Karen never let things go. Then came the official warnings. Letters from the HOA stating that my tree was a hazard, that it was blocking the view, and dropping too many leaves. None of it made sense. The tree was perfectly healthy, and no one else seemed to have a problem with it. Just Karen. I sent back a polite but firm response, stating that the tree was on my property, was not violating any HOA rules, and would not be removed. That didn't sit well with her. One evening, I caught her standing on the sidewalk, staring at my tree with a deep frown. When she saw me, she forced a smile and said, "You'll have to take that down sooner or later, you know." "No, I won't," I replied. She just huffed and walked away, but I had a bad feeling that this wasn't over. I was right. One morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of chainsaws. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard the unmistakable crack of wood splitting. Panic surged through me as I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. What I saw made my blood boil. A team of workers was cutting down my tree. I bolted out the front door, still in my pajamas, yelling for them to stop. The workers hesitated, looking uncertain, but before I could reach them, Karen stepped forward, arms crossed, looking smug as ever. "I told you that tree needed to go," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You have no right to do this." I shouted, "This is my property." Karen scoffed. "Actually, as the HOA president, I have the authority to remove unsightly obstructions that lower property values." "That's not how the law works, Karen." I snapped. "You can't just." I turned to the workers, demanding to know who hired them. One of them hesitated before muttering, "She did." Karen smirked. "I made an executive decision. You'll thank me later." I pulled out my phone and immediately called the police. I knew this wasn't just an HOA dispute. This was destruction of property. The workers continued cutting, albeit slower now, clearly aware that they were in the middle of something they shouldn't be involved in. By the time the officers arrived, most of the tree had already been hacked apart, the massive trunk teetering dangerously. I explained the situation, my anger boiling over as I pointed at Karen. She hired these people to cut down my tree without my permission. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, is this true?" Karen, ever the arrogant one, didn't even try to deny it. "It was necessary. That tree was a nuisance, and I—" "You don't have legal authority to make that decision," the officer interrupted. "This is private property." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but then something happened that none of us expected. The workers had just cut the final major section of the trunk. With one last splintering crack, the enormous tree began to fall, but not in the direction they had intended. No, instead of falling neatly onto the ground, it tilted toward Karen's house. For a moment, there was silence. Then, boom, the tree crashed directly onto Karen's roof. Shingles shattered, wood splintered, and part of her upper floor caved in under the weight of the massive oak. Dust and debris exploded into the air. Everyone stood frozen, mouths hanging open. Karen let out a strangled scream. "My house!" The officers turned to look at her, and one of them muttered, "Well, that's ironic." I crossed my arms, looking at the wreckage with a mix of shock and satisfaction. Guess nature had other plans. Karen, now red-faced and shaking, turned back to me with fury in her eyes. "This is your fault," she shrieked. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the tree you illegally cut down? The tree you insisted was a hazard?" I gestured at the scene. "Well, congratulations, Karen. You got what you wanted, it's gone. Too bad it took your house with it." She looked like she was about to explode, but before she could start screaming again, one of the officers stepped in. "Ma'am, we're going to need to talk about damages and trespassing charges." Karen's mouth snapped shut. For the first time since I'd known her, she had nothing to say. I turned to the workers, who were standing there awkwardly. "You guys might want to leave before she tries to blame you too." They didn't need to be told twice. They packed up their equipment and got out of there. As the officers started taking statements, I watched Karen, now pacing back and forth in front of her wrecked house, her face still red with rage and disbelief. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The dust was still settling, literally. A thick cloud of debris lingered in the air as broken shingles and wood fragment from Karen's roof continued to slide off in chunks. My once mighty oak tree now lay sprawled across her house, its massive branches stabbing through windows, its thick trunk crushing part of the upper floor like a battering ram from nature itself. The whole scene looked like something out of a disaster movie. And standing in the middle of it all, screaming like a banshee, was Karen. "My house! My beautiful house!" she shrieked, running toward the wreckage as if she could somehow lift the tree with sheer willpower. She stumbled on a loose piece of roof tile, nearly falling before catching herself. Her eyes darted wildly between the officers, the workers, and me, her rage barely contained. Then, her gaze locked onto me. "This is your fault," she spat, her fingers shaking as she pointed directly at me, her face a deep shade of red. "You set me up." I let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, my fault? You mean the tree that was perfectly fine until you hired someone to cut it down without permission?" "Yeah, totally my fault, Karen." She was fuming now, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Before she could snap back, one of the police officers, a tired-looking man who clearly had dealt with HOA drama before, sighed and flipped open his notepad. "Ma'am, let's go over this one more time," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You personally hired a crew to remove a tree from someone else's private property without their consent, correct?" Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "I had every right. That tree was a hazard, and as the HOA president, HOA regulations don't override property laws." The officer cut in, his tone now sharper. "This was a privately owned tree on his land, and you had no authority to remove it. That's destruction of property." I smirked, enjoying this way more than I probably should have. "And trespassing," I added, just to make sure she really felt it. The officer nodded. "And now, because of your actions, your house has sustained major damage. This is not just an HOA dispute. This is a legal matter." Karen's face twisted in frustration. Her usual smugness was gone, replaced by sheer panic. She turned to the workers she had hired, eyes wild. You cut it wrong. This is your fault." The workers, who had been awkwardly packing up their tools, looked at each other uneasily. One of them, a stocky guy in a bright yellow safety vest, scratched the back of his neck. Ma'am, you hired us. You said you had permission. We just did what we were told." Karen clenched her fists. "You should have cut it the other way." The worker shrugged. "Lady, trees fall where physics says they fall. You don't argue with gravity." I nearly choked trying to hold in my laughter. Karen, realizing she wasn't winning that argument, switched tactics. "Fine, then I'll sue," she declared dramatically, turning back to me. "I'll sue you." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "Existing. For having a dangerous tree," she shrieked. The officer sighed, clearly running low on patience. Ma'am, you personally ordered the removal of the tree. If anyone is responsible for property damage, it's you. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, opened it again, then shut it once more. It was as if her brain was struggling to process the idea that for once, she was the one facing consequences. And then, it got even worse for her. A loud crack echoed through the air. Another chunk of her roof, weakened from the impact, gave way under the weight of the fallen tree. More shingles and debris tumbled down, breaking apart as they hit the ground. Karen let out a piercing scream. My roof. One of the officers let out a low whistle. Yeah, you might want to call your insurance company. Karen spun toward him, her eyes wild. Insurance. Yes, they'll cover this, right? The officer shrugged. Depends. If they find out this was the result of your actions, they might not pay a cent. Karen looked like someone had just slapped her. But I crossed my arms. Hope you've got a good savings account, Karen. The color drained from her face. She knew. For the first time since she had taken over the HOA, Karen had no power, no authority, no smug superiority, just a wrecked house and a mess she had created all by herself. At that moment, some of the neighbors began gathering around, drawn in by all the commotion. Some of them had concerned expressions, but others looked downright amused. Mr. Thompson, an elderly man from down the street, leaned toward me and whispered, I've been waiting years to see karma catch up to that woman. I smirked. You and me both. Another neighbor, Mrs. Collins, crossed her arms. She's been terrorizing this community for months. I say this is what she gets. Karen, overhearing the conversation, whipped around. You people should be thanking me. I was making the neighborhood better. Mr. Thompson chuckled. Well, you sure changed it, that's for sure. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. By now, the officers had finished taking statements. One of them approached Karen with a firm expression. We'll be filing a report, he said. You'll likely be facing charges for trespassing and destruction of property. Karen let out a strangled sound, half gasp, half sob. I put my hand in my pockets and sighed dramatically. Well, I'd love to stay and chat, but I need to figure out how much you owe me for destroying my tree. I gave her a pointed look. Expect an invoice soon. Karen looked like she was going to faint. As the officers started escorting her away for further questioning, I took one last look at the fallen tree and the wreckage of Karen's house. Nature had taken its revenge, and I was just going to sit back and enjoy the show. Karen always carried herself with an air of untouchability. She acted as though being the HOA president made her some kind of ruler, dictating who could plant flowers, what colors houses could be painted, and, apparently, which trees were allowed to exist. But all of that power had gone her head, and now, she was about to lose everything. The fallout from her disastrous mistake didn't just hit overnight. It cascaded like a slow-motion train wreck. The very first blow landed when her insurance company refused to cover the damages to her house. The reason? Intentional negligence. I found out about it from Mrs. Collins, my ever-vigilant neighbor, who wasted no time calling me the moment she got wind of it. You're not going to believe this, she said, practically giddy. Karen's insurance claim was denied. I grinned, leaning back on my porch chair. Couldn't have happened to a better person. They said she caused the damage herself by ordering the tree removal. Mrs. Collins continued. Apparently, they don't cover damage caused by willful destruction of property. I laughed, shaking my head. So, she tried to get rid of my tree and ended up with a wrecked house and a massive bill instead. Sounds like karma has a great sense of humor. And that was just the start of Karen's problems. A few days later, a legal notice arrived at my door. I opened it with a satisfied smirk. My lawsuit against Karen had officially been filed. See, trees, especially old, mature oak trees like mine, are valuable. In many places, cutting down a tree without permission isn't just rude. It's a serious offense. Property damage lawsuits involving trees can range from a few $1,000s to six figures, depending on the tree's age and environmental value. So, I wasn't just suing for a couple $100. I was going after everything she owed me. Compensation for the illegal removal of my tree. The cost of planting a new one. Legal fees. the full financial consequences of her mistake. And I wasn't alone. It turns out my lawsuit was just one of many. Other neighbors had finally reached their breaking point with Karen's antics. Some were suing for wrongful fines she had issued as HOA president. Others had their own grievances, trespassing, harassment, and even intimidation tactics Karen had used to enforce her rules. It was like the floodgates had opened. Everyone wanted her gone. And then came the HOA meeting. Karen walked in, trying to keep up her usual smug attitude. But the moment she saw how many people had turned up, her face drained of color. Usually, HOA meetings were boring and half-empty. But this time, the entire neighborhood showed up, and no one was on her side. The moment the meeting started, people let loose. Karen has been abusing her power for years. She finds people for the dumbest reasons, but then she destroys private property and expects to get away with it. She's a menace. We need to vote her out. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She tried to fight back, to argue, but she was completely outnumbered. And after an overwhelming vote, Karen was officially removed as HOA president. She stormed out of the meeting, her face twisted with fury, but for the first time in years, she had no power left, no authority, no way to control the situation. But her real nightmare? That was just beginning. A few weeks later, my case went to court. I had all the evidence, photos of the tree before and after, security footage of the workers cutting it down, and a solid argument backed by legal precedent. Karen tried to argue that she was just looking out for the neighborhood, but the judge wasn't buying it. And in the end, I won. Karen was ordered to pay me tens of thousands of dollars in damages. The judge ruled that she had knowingly and illegally destroyed private property, and she was fully responsible for every penny. When the ruling was announced, Karen's face was a mix of rage and sheer panic. She couldn't afford it. With the cost of her home repairs, legal fees, and now the court-mandated damages she owed me, she was drowning financially. And within a few months, she put her house up for sale. The sign went up quietly, without fanfare. But the neighborhood noticed. And let me tell you, when the sold sign was finally placed in her yard, it was a celebration. People literally threw a block party. Music played, drinks were shared, and the entire atmosphere felt lighter, as if the weight of Karen's oppressive rule had finally lifted. At one point, Mr. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, raised his glass and toasted, "To karma." I laughed, clinking my bottle against his. To karma indeed. And as I stood there, watching the new family move into Karen's old house, normal, friendly people who actually cared about the community, I knew one thing for sure. Karen had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood. But in the end, she destroyed herself. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. Karma took care of everything.